Fact and fiction. There's a lot of folks going around talking about the Common Core standards, fact and fiction. They're charging that the other side is full of myths and then fact checking everyone just like they do in the media. So what I want to give you is just some basic outlines first of what it is. I'm looking at a big map of the United States that has every single state highlighted but Minnesota, Nebraska, Texas, Alaska, and Virginia. So every single state, including Wisconsin, besides those five, and Minnesota actually half adopted Common Core. They picked the English standard. In 2010, they got rid of their academic standards in math and English and picked instead this one set of standards called the Common Core. What is the Common Core? So basically, standards are a list of what a bunch of people got together and sat down and wrote and thought that kids should know in English, language arts, and math in grades K through 12. So they basically made a big list saying, what age they should be learning to do division and multiplication, what age they should be able to read fluently, what writing skills they should have in different grades, and so on and so forth. So right now, the Common Core is just English and math, but there's soon, in fact, I think it's coming out this summer, some science standards that are almost out, and most states have said that they're going to adopt those too. And they also have talked about social studies standards, but those are really politically difficult because then you get really explicitly a left or right wing. So they have just kind of released a general, what they call a framework of social studies standards, and are leaving those to the long future. And note that I will make right here about the science standards is that they are a lot more controversial than the math and English standards. It's not controversial in public school curriculum to talk only about evolution from from kindergarten all the way up. But it is controversial to, as these standards do, tell children that humans are dangerous to the planet and that the global warming is an accepted, incontrovertible fact, and that government action is required to fix global warming, all of which is in the state standards. So there's a number of heavily political things in the science standards that are a lot more obvious than the things that happen in the math and English standards so far. So the goal of putting these standards in place is, you'll hear this phrase a lot, college and career readiness. So the idea is that, of course, what you would think is common sense, right? You want a child to graduate from high school ready for college without remedial work. That's a big problem right now in U.S. schools. There's lots and lots of remediation required of high school graduates. And then you also, if they don't go to college, you want the kids to be able to jump right into a career, to be, able to learn on the job, to think on their feet, to be able to work with their employer and the tasks that are required of them. So because U.S. schools for a long time been turning out millions and millions of kids who aren't ready for either of those things when they graduate, a bunch of folks got together and said, we know what's going to fix the problem, having all states require the same thing of kids in every grade. So the bunch of folks that got together and decided this and decided what would go into these standards, they were commissioned by two groups. The first one is called the National Governors Association, and the second is called the Chief Council of State School Officers. So it's important that you know that even though these two groups have official sounding names, they don't actually have any legislative grants of authority from states. They're nonprofits. The NGA is funded primarily by the federal government, and the Chief Council of State School Officers is largely funded by private foundations, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is a major portion of that. So I'll talk about some of the funding behind the folks who wrote the Common Core in a little bit. But it's important that you know that these are what basically trade associations. So they have official names, but none of these have really the power to say what we decree must happen. That belongs to the state legislatures, state boards of education, and actual instituted government set up here, in our constitutions. So what happened was that they set up a bunch of committees to write these standards, but essentially there were four people who wrote the standards, two in math and two in English, that were what they call the lead writers of the Common Core, and they sat down and put together all these ideas from a bunch of different committees, and then they came out with these standards. And so I have on my graphs here a timeline that is pretty illustrative to kind of show the process that happened through getting people to national standards. The first date to keep in your mind is June 2nd, 2010. That is the date that the standards actually came out and were published finally. There was a draft that came out before then, but in their final form, they were actually published on June 2nd, 2010. And this is important to you in Wisconsin because that's the exact same day that Wisconsin Superintendent Tony Evers signed them. He said, Wisconsin's doing this. So I have a timeline up here that talks about kind of the federal precedents to Common Core. The first thing that a lot of people are familiar with now is called No Child Left Behind. That is basically when Congress went through and redid the biggest federal law that regards education. So what it did was require all states, you've probably heard of this, all states to have testing proficient in math and English in each grade. Well, the grades actually vary, but usually grades 3 through 8, and then I think grades 10 and so on and so forth. So they basically did a huge, big liberal conservative compromise. The liberals got what they want, which was a ton of new money from the federal government into schools, which is really, a big new growth in money from the feds. And the conservatives got what they want, which is what they call accountability, test-based accountability, which is in return for all of this money, they want some evidence that schools are doing something with it. But the federal government cannot require that states do anything in education. As you may notice, the U.S. Constitution says nothing about education, and so the 10th Amendment reserves that right to the states. So the way that the federal government gets around this, as it gets around lots of other things, is by basically using money as a bribe for states. So it basically says, we're going to tax all your people, and if you want some of the money back from your citizens, you'll have to do what we say. So that's how No Child Left Behind works. So they said, if you want any federal education money, you have to test all your kids in all these grades, and you have to, report the results by various different minority groups and so on and so forth, disabled kids and so on and so forth. And then you have to submit to our definitions of what a qualified teacher is, and all kinds of other regulations. But because the federal government can't control state tests, it's not only constitutionally but by several statutes, including the one creating the U.S. Department of Education. They say, U.S. government, federal government, you are not allowed to touch curriculum testing. So the way, again, that the federal government got around this was to say, okay, states, you decide what counts as proficient. And then whatever you say counts as proficient is what will determine whether you get federal money. So, well, guess what happened? All the states set a really low bar to say, look, almost all of our kids are proficient. We can get all the federal money, no problem. So that's going to become important really later when we talk about a lot of complaints about low state standards. It's important that you know that the reason that state standards were really low, an important reason that state standards were low, was because the federal government set up an incentive for states to reduce their standards by tying that to the money that they would get. So let's move forward to 2007. Two giant education foundations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Broad Foundation, they pledged $60 million for a campaign to get national education standards. In the following year, the National Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers began the Common Core project. So those are the two groups that I talked about earlier, those trade associations. So Common Core, a lot of folks like to talk about, Common Core is Obama Core, blah, blah. It's then label and tie it to the president because he's particularly unpopular among conservatives. But President Obama didn't come into office until well after the committees were at work creating their happy little standards. So what President Obama actually did do, however, was with the stimulus bill in February 2009, when that was passed, it included two things that are really important to talking about Common Core. The first one is in the general stimulus bill. It required every single state to set up what is called a longitudinal student database. So we'll talk about student databases and data tracking in a little bit. But the second thing that it did was it created this giant slush fund for the U.S. Department of Education called Race to the Top. So they created a competitive grant program that basically said to states during a time of huge recession, when the recession had just hit their tax dollars, or their tax coffers, it really knocked them down. They had this big pot of money that said, we'll give you part of this big pot of money if you show us how much you're going to do exactly what we want. So that was called Race to the Top. So in order to get extra points on their application for more federal money under Race to the Top, states had to adopt Common Core standards. Now that's not explicit in the documents. What the documents actually say is you have to adopt standards that any number of states share. But the only standards that fit that definition at the time and currently are the Common Core standards. So they essentially said, if you want the money, you've got to adopt Common Core. So that was one of several ways. There's a second way that the federal government pushed Common Core on states. The second way that the federal government did that is because No Child Left Behind did not work out very well. It's extremely awkward and clumpy, and it imposes millions and millions of dollars in regulation burdens on states and local school districts. When Congress failed, like they've been failing to do a lot of things recently, when Congress failed to reauthorize the law, it was due to be updated in 2007, I believe. Well, they still haven't done that, so here we are, 6 years later, no reauthorization of New Child Left Behind. So in the absence of Congress taking action, the Obama administration decided we'll take action. So U.S. Education Secretary Arne Duncan said, states, give me plans for how you will do exactly what I want, uh, um, how you will please the U.S. Department of Education, and then we will tell you that you don't actually have to follow what the No Child Left Behind law says. So I think right now about 33 states have gotten a No Child Left Behind waiver, and 12 more have asked for one, and their applications are pending. So one of the things that a state had to do to get a No Child Left Behind waiver was adopt the Common Core standards. So those are the two ways that the federal government pushed states to adopt these standards that the states share. So that's the stimulus bill. That's February 2009. Then moving forward to June 2010, that's when, as I said before, the Common Core standards were released. So I'm going to give you a closer timeline on this so you can see that states were required by the federal government to adopt Common Core before Common Core was actually even released. So January 19th, 2010, that's the first deadline that states had to apply for Race to the Top. To get, the most amount of points for Race to the Top for this federal pot of money, they had to certify to the federal government, yes, we've adopted Common Core, and this is, 6 months before the Common Core is even published. So this is actually 3 months before the draft of the Common Core is even published. They haven't even seen, a sketch of the Common Core before they're telling the federal government, yes, we'll do this. So the draft of the Common Core was actually released in March 2010. Because Race to the Top is it's kind of like a rolling. They'd had several waves of grant applications. The second Race to the Top deadline to adopt Common Core to get some of this federal money was June 1st, 2010, a day before the Common Core was actually released. So again, the federal government is saying, here, states, you want our money, you want us to do something that you want, well, you have to do something we want. You have to sign on to something that's going to change almost everything about education. And we'll talk about that in a second, how it changed everything. And so the Common Core is released on June 2nd, 2010. By July 20th, 2010, the majority of states have formally adopted it. Most of them with very little notice to the public, with no public hearing, almost, very little fanfare in the media that this giant shift has happened. And then in September, that was when the Obama administration began waiving No Child Left Behind for the states. And by November 4th of 2011, 44 states, so almost all of the states except one, have said, yes, we've signed on to the Common Core. So that's 5 months between when it comes out and, when all the states have said, yep, we're signed in. We're doing this. So then the next thing that I want to do to illustrate for you is the giant impact that Common Core is having on public and private schools. And we'll talk about the private school connection in a little bit. So as I mentioned, there's 45 and a half states that are Common Core states right now. And they enroll 87% of U.S. public school children. The vast majority of U.S. children are in states that have adopted Common Core. That's 42.9 million children. So 5.5 million kids are in private schools, and there are 6.6 million in non-Common Core public schools. So there's 6.6 million in the states like Texas, Alaska, and Virginia. But many, many kids in private schools, and especially Catholic schools, many kids in non-Common Core public schools are going to use Common Core textbooks and classroom materials anyway, because now all of the education publishers, that's all they're publishing. So there's very little choice for folks who want to actually opt out, even if their state hasn't adopted Common Core. And the reasons for that is because the U.S. education textbook, education videos, education worksheets, that market is almost a monopoly. The big player in that is the education publishing group called Pearson. So Common Core impacts basically everything about education and what kids are going to learn in those subjects, except the buildings, except the buses, except the lunch. So anything in the classroom, Common Core touches it. So it changes the technology that kids are going to use. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It changes the textbooks and the classroom materials that kids are going to use. It changes how teachers are going to be trained both in college and then professional development once they get into the workforce, or current teachers who of course aren't in college anymore. That has to be completely all done. It changes teacher evaluations. So now teachers have to be evaluated on how well they present. They, do it the Common Core way. They say what the Common Core, tells them to say in their classrooms. And there are a number of states, I think between a third and a half of states actually tie teacher promotion, teacher pay, teacher hiring and firing to those teacher evaluations. The tests. So if the children in the classroom aren't doing particularly well in a state where teachers, are it matters to their job how their kids perform on the tests, then Common Core and completely actually changes who gets hired and who gets fired, or whether they get promoted or rewarded, and so on and so forth. So, of course, a big way that Common Core impacts education is through these tests, because tests often determine school funding, school bonuses, or if schools get funding taken away from them. They determine whether a state will take over a school in many instances. And like I mentioned, in some states, they determine hiring and firing for teachers. So this is this is a big deal. It is a massive change in education. So that's kind of an introduction to what the Common Core is, what it touches, and now I wanted to kind of outline what is quality and effectiveness. 3 points where people are arguing now about the Common Core after they finally let us, see what was in it. So the first one is quality and effectiveness, whether it's a high quality standards, whether it provides for a good, solid academic curriculum, whether standards will actually benefit or do anything to change what kids learn or affect the outcomes of kids. Then there's, of course, the big question of state control, local control versus federal or centralized control. There's questions over the cost to taxpayers of all of these massive changes, the new books that they have to buy, the new technology they have to buy, all the teacher training, so on and so forth. And then there's kind of the super creepy part, which is the data mining and the what they call effective testing, which is where a test does not measure what you know, so much as it measures what you believe, think, your attitudes, beliefs, habits, and actions. So there's a shift into that sort of testing coming along with Common Core as well. So we'll take those points in order. I've grouped some of them just to go over them more efficiently. So the first one I have is quality and effectiveness. So the first question that this was a huge shocker to me when I started learning about Common Core, this is the question you would think people would ask before they made a big change to standards, which is, do education standards have much effect on students? And the answer surprisingly seems to be no. So here's some examples and some evidence and research for that conclusion. If you look at our international competitors, the OECD countries, folks like let's see here, France, the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan. So out of that batch of developed countries, 9 of the 10 lowest scoring countries in math and 8 of the lowest scoring countries in science have centralized education standards. So for them, they have centralized education standards, they have national education standards, and their kids don't perform very well on international tests. The same is true for 8 to 10 of the highest scoring countries. So in short, from looking at international comparisons, whether a country has national standards or not doesn't seem to have any effect on how the students perform. And now if you move to the United States and examine whether states that have high quality requirements for kids, high quality standards, and see if their kids learn more versus states who have low quality standards, do their kids learn less? The answer is there's basically no relationship between high standards and high scoring students, or low standards and low scoring students. So there's a Brookings study that I've linked to in my notes here that says there's virtually no relationship between the quality of state education standards and the achievement test scores of students in the respective states. So what that basically means is a state can have really great standards and the students do really poorly on tests, or the state can have really terrible standards but the students perform very well. So according to this, there's basically no link between high standards and student achievement. So the question then is, if we're trying, the whole point of school is to teach children things, and standards don't seem to actually accomplish that, why would we have standards? Why would we, put so much time and effort into this giant change? Well, maybe for some of the changes that are coming about as a result of common guess. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. Another important thing to think about in the standards and effectiveness is that the Common Core has never been field tested. Nobody ever tried it out, not one school district. So this is another important point when talking to folks, that nobody ever tried out the Common Core. So you would think that, especially with folks who talk about that the Common Core is rigorous and field tested, and the simple question you would be is, where's your proof? There is no proof. And we will talk about that also. In fact, I'll slip in this right here. All of the academics on the Common Core's own what they called a validation committee, whose job it was to say, yes, we've checked all the research, we've we've seen that this is really solid and well put together. All of the academics on that panel said we refuse to sign. We refuse to sign off on Common Core. They have given us no evidence that there is research supporting all of the things that they're changing or promoting, and there's no research that they have actually, as they promised, done what they call international benchmarking, which is compared the standards or have ratcheted them up to the levels of the best performing countries. No evidence. So this isn't just my assertion. This is the folks who actually know about standards, who that's their professional job, to check it out. And they said, we haven't seen the evidence. We can't sign our names to this. So the argument that folks still have that for saying that standards are really important is that, well, these goals for kids don't matter, but unless states follow through really well. So their goal is to say, well, this has never worked before, and we've never tried it out before, but we just know that if we do a really, really good job, that it's all going to work really great and actually really benefit kids. I cannot think of any other field where people take their pet projects and say, oh, I know how to fix everything. Here, let me create my little utopia. But the folks with Common Core got to actually inflict their utopian ideas on the whole country. So the entire Common Core status is designed to get states in line, to say, you've got to implement it the way that we say. We've got to make sure that this is really important because the goals that we set out for kids don't matter unless states follow through. So we're going to make sure you follow through. That's why the tests are really important and tied to everything. So the question then, of course, is why does everyone seem to think that the core is going to get results? Well, a central goal, and I have links in here from the folks who support Common Core, who've created Common Core, who are carrying out Common Core, that say one of their main goals is to create a crisis in education, because the Common Core tests are expected to fail many, many more students. So, for example, Kentucky has been the first state that put in place some tests that are not Common Core tests, but they're supposed to be aligned to the Common Core. And, a third fewer kids pass the test. That's a giant drop. So people who are pushing Common Core say, we are trying, to show folks all the kids are going to fail, and this is going to show everyone that we have an education crisis that needs fixing. In fact, one of the 4 lead Common Core writers, those 4 people I talked about who mostly wrote the Common Core, his name is David Pullmann. He now runs the College Board, which is in control of the SAT and all the SAT-related tests. His quote is, expect outrage. They're trying to get folks outraged about how poorly their kids perform on the tests. Now, I have to include the caveat that it is probably accurate to say that kids, the tests that states have are very poor tests, and they pass way many more kids than should be passed. So part of that is accurate. But I personally take, it is a political tactic, as you probably know, to manufacture a crisis so that you can then solve it with your preferred solution that gets, far more of your policy objectives in place. So I personally and politically object to that as a tactic for attempting to use fear to get people to usher into, to herd, stampede off the cliff into your nice, little waiting area prepared for them. Another argument that they provided, I mentioned earlier, that they think Common Core is going to get results, is that Common Core has momentum and energy to provide carrots and teacher evaluations and test failures for sticks. So then the question comes, is Common Core high quality? Are they good academic standards? Will they, have kids learning at a faster pace, more things in a year, so on and so forth? So are they of higher quality? So the Thomas B. Fordham Institute they call themselves a conservative organization, and they receive money from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which also sponsored Common Core, to compare every state's individual standards to Common Core. So they found that the Common Core English standards are better than about 3/4 of state standards. So that includes Wisconsin. They also found the Common Core's math standards are better than all but about 10 states. And again, this is probably accurate, but as I mentioned earlier, there are some reasons that states have really low standards that have to do with the federal government pushing them to do that. So it's kind of odd to me that folks say, look, the feds, a centralized solution made everything go wrong, so let's propose another centralized solution. So on this slide, I run through some educational arguments for and against. So I'll give you some of the things that people are talking about that have called out that are part of the argument for and against Common Core as it relates to the specific things that they have kids do. So here are some arguments against. There are several states, particularly California, which required all students to take algebra in the eighth grade. And the reason that this is important is because kids cannot get to calculus in high school unless they do take algebra in eighth grade. And if you don't take calculus in high school, you're basically entering college behind for any science, math, engineering field. So for children who are advanced or science math focused, that is really important that they get algebra in eighth grade. So the Common Core does not say that you cannot take algebra in eighth grade, but what it does do is it erases states' higher standards of having algebra be the norm for eighth grade, so that states and local districts can kind of ratchet down what they expect students to do. So California actually eliminated its requirement that all kids get algebra in eighth grade, and so what that basically means is a bunch of districts have pushed kids back a year, which it negatively impacts the future, the job choices, and the money that they can earn in the future. The Common Core also in English has this kind of weird requirement that you might have heard about. It talks about informational text. So this is as opposed to literature. It wants kids to be reading more informational text. And what does that mean? That can mean everything from the Declaration of Independence to, and this is actually inside one of the suggested materials on the Common Core's list, not required but suggested example of material, some federal regulations regarding insulation. And schools have included everything from bus schedules in that to Justin Bieber's autobiography to some really great autobiographies like Up with Slavery. But the weird thing about it is not so much that it tries to get kids reading more things in a lot of different fields, not just fiction. The weird thing is that it imposes percentages on different grades. So in the younger grades, elementary grades, it says 50% of what kids read in school must be literature and 50% must be this informational text. And then it says by the time their kids get to high school, 12th grade, kids should have 70% informational text and 30% literature. So it's kind of a hard, how do you say, it's a nuanced thing, because what has been reported in the news is they're requiring teachers to get rid of all their literature, to put in this informational text that they're not prepared to teach. English teachers are used to teaching literature, and that is actually happening. There are lots of teachers across the country who are have said, I'm ditching my poetry segment, I'm getting rid of this unit that I really love on Walt Whitman or on the To Kill a Mockingbird. But the Common Core doesn't actually require that, because it says the the percentages apply across all subjects at a side study. So they could read informational text in science and history and so on and so forth. But that it's very difficult. We'll talk about with the centralization concerns. For someone 1,200 miles away to write something, for 3.2 million teachers to encounter and interpret, that's going to get them all to understand what they should be doing and how. So because of that, there's a lot of confusion about things like this literature requirement. And to me, it's just odd to have the 50 or 70% divide at all. What should the kids be reading next? I don't know. Have they filled their percentage of informational text? Another thing that the literature requirements, and this is again from one of the authors of the Common Core English standards, one of the other things that it requires is what they call a cold reading, where you don't learn a context about the passage, but only the passage. So the example that David Coleman gave in a sample lesson was about the Gettysburg Address. So don't tell them the context where Lincoln was reading it, the battlefield, the seriousness of the situation. Just let them approach that through their own experience, have their own experience with the text, so on and so forth. And so that is also questionable pedagogically, or pedagogically just means teaching practice, the way that teachers teach. And another thing that is a strike against the Common Core is that because of it, a lot of school districts have ditched their curriculum, their previous math curriculum, and started implementing what is commonly known as fuzzy math. So this is when you get kids literally drawing pictures about how they feel about numbers rather than learning to divide and add. This is where you have kids trying to do literally college level problems and figuring it out on their own with no direction from the teacher, because it's supposed to teach them to think on their own. Folks who criticize that say that that's really unfair to children because, well, they don't have the math background to be able to approach problems that complex when they're young. They need to be given the tools to understand numbers before they can get up to reasoning mathematically at the college level. So parents and teachers who do not like fuzzy math because it especially disadvantages kids who are not good at numbers or kids who have problems at home really object to the resurgence of fuzzy math. As I mentioned about the science standards, they're really heavily politically correct and they're actually scientifically debatable. And there's some other things besides the politicization. For example, in chemistry, they leave out things like acids and bases. Some really core things that anyone who was a chemistry teacher would keep in the curriculum. So there's also problems there as well. The last thing that's on the con side is that the standards promote an experimental form of geometry that has only been tried with Russian gifted students, and there it failed miserably. It's just a totally it's a way that very few people have ever used, and that's because it doesn't work very well. So why they decided to put that in Common Core, I'm not sure. So let's stop from being so negative and give some of the reasons, educational reasons to support Common Core for its education quality. So one of them is that it encourages students and teachers to have students not write the typical self-centered weak writing. What do I, Timmy, the fourth grader, think about history? Timmy, as a fourth grader, you don't know jack about history. We are going to teach you something about history, and then when you're older and you have more experience, then you can analyze it. Or totally entirely non-academic exercises of writing self-expression as opposed to an actual essay. And again, I'm not criticizing self-expression, but what I am saying is kids should also learn to write structured essays. That's what people expect from schools. So that's a good thing that the Common Core does. Its suggested materials include some really great classic works over a large amount of what schools have been feeding kids, which is pulp fiction, like that Justin Bieber autobiography that I mentioned, or things like the Twilight series, which are enjoyable reading for kids, but not really, they don't stretch their brains, they don't teach them new vocabulary, and so on and so forth. So that's a positive. The only problem with that is it's a suggested reading list, and so it's not binding on anyone, and teachers can really continue teaching whatever books they wanted. The research on reading for kids is really, really strong, showing that kids do need a very wide span of background information to be good readers. So what that basically means is reading is like Velcro. You have to have something to stick each new piece of information to as you're reading about it. So the more different information that kids encounter, read, the better readers they become and the better thinkers they become. And so that's why Common Core does the informational text thing. But to be honest, there's no proof that informational text as opposed to literature is really supposed to create that good reading material that kids need. The Common Core has an emphasis on source documents, on proving your arguments, on using evidence for your claim. That's also really important. It's a good thing to teach kids. And something that is a benefit to it is that it provides alignment throughout teachers' grades in most states. So one of the big things that people talk about is, if kids are going to move, they won't miss as much if they go to a school that's teaching the exact same thing. The caveat to that is that very, very, very few kids ever move out of state during a school year, something like 0.03%. So there's a very small group of kids that concern would apply to. And even if that's, if you're concerned about getting kids to never have any gaps in their education, then you might as well require every teacher to be on the exact same page at the exact same minute of the exact same day. Otherwise, kids really are just going to miss stuff anyway. So then let's talk about, from expert opinion, people who know about standards, whether the standards are high quality academically. They're actually pretty mediocre. Comparing them to the best state standards and to international competitors, several content experts who know about standards, who have written the best standards in the country, have just plain said these aren't really that great. They're not sickeningly awful, but they're, the label that folks put on them as rigorous and benchmarked, it's pretty much flat out a lie. It's not true. So there's a couple of folks that I have listed here on my presentation that I'll read to you. So former U.S. Department of Education official and mathematician Zeev Werman says Common Core math standards would graduate students, quote, below the admission requirement of most four-year state colleges. And then another quote, the highest achieving nations begin algebra in grade 8, among other complaints that he has about the math standards. The University of Arkansas professor and reading expert Sandra Stotsky served on the Common Core Validation Committee. I mentioned her earlier, but she refused to sign it. And one of her reasons was that the writers refused to provide research supporting the Common Core and linking it to international best. Some of her other reasons include hard to follow, low quality English standards that have empty skill sets. And then I have done a lot of discussion with some of the nation's top public schools, and it was important for me to survey public schools because they have to accept any student that comes to them. So, and I also asked a bunch of schools that have really good success with poor kids, so not just smart suburban white kids. I talked to a bunch of different public schools about what do you require of kids, how does Common Core compare to what you expect, and they universally told me we ignore Common Core because it's lower quality than what we already have been telling our kids to do for decades. And as I mentioned earlier, the proponents of Common Core ignore the federal role in pushing states to lower standards. So in short, is the Common Core high quality? No, it is not. And that is not just an assertion. There's very good evidence to back it up from a wide variety of experts who know what I'm talking about. It's entirely debatable at the very least. So the next topic I'm going to talk about is federal involvement. So the claim about Common Core is that this is the phrase state-led. It's a state-led initiative. The federal government didn't do it. The states got together within these private trade organizations and they made Common Core, not federal, state. As I mentioned earlier, the organizations that created Common Core are actually funded by the federal government. They're also funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which spent about $173 million on all of its Common Core related work to date. And that includes a bunch of grants to places, chambers of commerce to get them to like Common Core, a bunch of grants to people who wined and dined state lawmakers and policymakers, and grants to groups like the PTA, national PTA, and local PTAs, and local and state departments of education. Organizations creating Common Core were also funded by big businesses who are now making a lot of money and stand to make a lot more from Common Core. And here's another really important thing that kind of counters the state-led claim, which is that the federal government provided all of the funds for the two groups that are writing national Common Core tests. So we'll talk about Common Core tests in a minute. But there are basically two groups of states, and some states are in both groups. There are two sets of national tests to go with Common Core that are right now being written. And so the federal government provided every single penny of their operating cash. Not only that, the federal government has recently appointed a panel to review these tests. We're not talking just, they're reviewing test structure, quality, but they're actually literally, looking at what the test questions are. So if that is not influence over curriculum, I don't know what is. So here's another quote from President Obama in his 2013 State of the Union address, and there are several quotes of him from various speeches that sound similar. He said that his administration, so he himself says this is a federal initiative, convinced almost every state, that's a quote, to adopt Common Core through stimulus grants. And the state-led claim is also countered by the fact that states are not allowed to change Common Core. They can add up to 15% of information that they want to kind of complement Common Core, but this 15% is not going to be tested, so if teachers don't teach it, it doesn't make any difference to their students' test scores or the state's test scores. Not only this, the private nonprofits who wrote the Common Core hold the copyright. So here I have another pro and con. There are political arguments for and against. First of all, this is a very massive expense for an untested, politically suspect change. There's a review that estimated that the Common Core changes would cost the nation $16 billion over the next 7 years to kind of roll it out into schools. The Common Core is already influencing private and home schools because of testing requirements and curriculum. So it's going to be hard for homeschoolers and private schools to get non-Common Core textbooks. Not only that, it's not just state tests that are being changed into Common Core tests, which in a lot of states, private schools have to administer state tests. In a lot of states, this includes Milwaukee and Wisconsin, private schools that accept voucher funds have to administer state tests. But not only this, the SAT and the ACT, those two college entrance exams you got to do well on if you want to get into college, those are being aligned to Common Core. So if you want to go to college, no matter what school you went to, homeschool, private school, public school, charter school, you got to do well on those tests. So you have to have learned the Common Core way of thinking. Another problem with Common Core is that it takes decisions about schools and curriculum, what kids learn and how they learn it, and in what sequence they learn it, out of the hands of the people closest to children, parents, taxpayers, and their elected representatives. As I mentioned earlier, here's another con. Federal involvement in curriculum and testing is flatly illegal and unconstitutional. And here's my last one. It provides an opportunity for politicized dictatorial control over what kids learn. When you basically have a central organization that isn't controlled by the states or by schools, by local taxpayers, you basically create a really great opportunity for a bunch of strong lobbyists to start putting into the tests and the curriculum whatever they want to happen, because it's easier to influence centralized power than it is to influence decentralized power. So here are some arguments, political arguments for the Common Core. It gives you a way to compare student performance across states rather than trying to compare apples to oranges with the different state tests. But I think this is a really bad argument for Common Core because there already was a way to compare student performance across states. It was called the NAEP, the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That is a national test just given for diagnostic purposes, administered in every single state by the National Center for Education Statistics, and that provided an apples to apples comparison of how kids in different states were performing on a variety of different measures, including history, science, math, and English, or reading. So we have NAEP, so I don't know why we need any other tests. Another pro argument for the Common Core: mobility is really high, but especially among the poor. I mentioned that earlier. As this existing state standards are generally terrible, and this is absolutely true. They're politicized, they're weak, they're vague, they're really not appropriate. And like I mentioned earlier, some Common Core emphases on content to an extent, like I mentioned, they're better than existing widespread practice. So I have a quote here talking about state versus federal control. This is from Governor Bob McDonnell of Virginia. He is the chair of the Republican Governors Association. So recently he was asked about Common Core, and he said, quote, "I don't want to have a federal bureaucracy monitoring whether or not we're having the right programs in our schools. We don't need the federal government with the Common Core telling us how to run our schools in Virginia. We'll use our own system, which is very good. It's empirically tested." And in this radio interview, he also said his state's federal Race to the Top grant application was, quote, penalized because in Virginia we had chosen not to adopt the Common Core standards. So the next section that I'm going to talk about is the cost of technology and testing. So because of Common Core, schools need new or more textbooks, computers, teacher training, learning materials such as workbooks, lesson plans, even classroom posters, IT support, and broadband internet. Now, why all of the tech stuff? Well, it's because all of the testing for Common Core is planned to be only online, all online. Every student must take it on a computer by 2017 to 2018, that school year. So for a lot of schools, especially rural schools, this is a giant expense for them. And not only that, it's not just the computers, but they have to have a giant amount of broadband internet for what could be hundreds of kids taking these tests at the same time or during the same week, which then, of course, requires lots of IT support, which is also expensive and harder to come by, especially for rural districts. So there are some cost estimates, one of which I mentioned earlier. National cost estimates for Common Core being rolled out have varied from $3 billion over 5 years to $16 billion over 7. And most of these estimates are even ones that states have done, and most states have not done a cost estimate. Most of them ignore the tech requirements. So the tech requirements requires not only hardware, so computers, tech labs, earphones, microphones, but they also require better internet connections or more newer operating systems and, like I said, tech support. Not only that, the new tests are going to cost way more to administer each year. So, for example, in Georgia, their previous state tests cost taxpayers about $5 per student per year. Now, those pen and paper bubble tests are really well known for being cheap and simple for school districts. But the Common Core tests are going to cost Georgians $22 per kid. That's a huge increase. That's more than 4 times, as much they're going to start spending on testing. And something that's kind of wild is that nobody really knows the cost because almost no state actually estimated the cost before they signed on, which to me, again, doesn't seem like a really prudent thing to do, to say, yes, we're going to make this massive change, but oh, I don't care how much it costs. The taxpayers will pay for it. So we don't know a lot about these Common Core tests because they're writing them right now, and it is, well, frankly, a lot of a black box surrounding them. So they're being done by some private groups, so you can't say, I'm a citizen, I'm paying for you, which you are because they're federally funded, but you just can't, you can't say, I want to know what you're doing because I'm paying for it. But what we know about the tests from things that have come out from the things that the two groups have said about them, they're reducing the emphasis that tests have on knowledge. They're looking for performance. So instead of multiple choice questions, Instead of getting the correct answer specifically on one item, on one item, there are going to be more essays, open response questions, and computer tests. So students will have to, for example, move things around on the screen like it's a mini video game. They call these two testing groups consortia. One of them, they're called PARC. These are acronyms. PARC and Smarter Balance. Wisconsin is in the Smarter Balance coalition, and it's the group that is known to be considerably more progressive and squashy than the other. And so basically, there are a bunch of liberals running both testing consortia, but especially in Smarter Balance. Liberals don't like tests because they traditionally measure knowledge, not political correctness, attitudes, behaviors. And tests also provide clear accountability. You either know the question or you don't, and that indicates whether your teacher has actually taught you anything or not. The PARC tests are the group said that are going to take students 8 to 10 hours each student 9 times a year. So, and the Smarter Balance tests are going to take a lot less time, but still pretty significant, 7 to 8.5 hours at the end of the year, with optional tests schools can administer throughout the year. So right now there are some schools that are pilot testing these tests, and they're going to be fully operational in all Common Core states by 2014-2015, so 2 school years from now, or 1 school year from this fall. There's been a survey that I've been following of what they call education insiders. These are folks who actually work at the testing companies, at different folks that have contracts with them, that work in policymakers' offices and so on and so forth. And they have been saying for several months that they're really worried that both assessment consortia, both testing groups, are on the wrong track. So the number of folks saying that PARC is on the wrong track in the most recent poll, March 13th, 65%. Before that, it was 52 and 45. So PARC has a stronger record, stronger reputation. Smarter Balanced, they have basically had a 70% disapproval rating since last August. So here are some quotes from those education insiders about why they believe that both testing groups are on the wrong track. Here's a quote. It's not going to be fully ready on time, and no one seems to know how this is going to be paid for over time. Smarter Balanced is still struggling to develop an assessment that is up to the highest expectations of Common Core. And PARC is finding that it's harder than it thought to make a test that is up to the Common Core. And then here's another quote. Everyone is fretting about Smarter Balanced, but PARC is struggling behind the scenes. As usual, the education media is missing in action. Now we're getting into the data tracking part of the Common Core, which to me is the absolute reason why my kids are not going to be in a public school. And here is why. President Obama and U.S. Education Secretary Arne Duncan have both said that they want a cradle-to-career data system tracking kids. They've said this several times publicly. So as I mentioned earlier, those stimulus grants that required every single state to make what they call a longitudinal data system that the federal government can access. So longitudinal data is not just one snapshot of how a kid did in English in 3rd grade in 1999, but it's how that child did his or her entire school career. So longitudinal, following the child for a long time. So they want to link this. So every state is right now making one of these. And the federal government has, as a requirement, put in stimulus money, you have got to share all of this data you're going to pull on kids with the federal government. And what's the federal government going to do with it? Well, the U.S. Department of Education unilaterally, by itself, just because it wanted to, reinterpreted federal privacy law so that it can give these student records that states collect to essentially anyone. I'm not even kidding. This includes companies and school volunteers with no parent consent. So your child's file can go to anyone, and you have no say in it. Now, federal agencies have also outlined data that states could track. These include blood type, hobbies, nicknames, social security numbers, family voting status, finger and eye prints, family income, and religion. There's hundreds more. So the goal is to have a comprehensive file on each student that links their health records to their school test scores, to their behavioral, their discipline records, their work history and training, psychological information, school discipline records, social welfare or police records, and so on and so forth. These are going to be comprehensive personal files. And another thing that they put into all of these agreements with states is that the information must be student level data. So until this point, the big databases that they've had and containing student test results haven't include what they call personally identifiable information. You couldn't take the test score and say, oh, I know this is Johnny Smith in Appleton, and he goes to this school. No, it's just a pile of numbers for, this school in this state. So the new way of tracking kids is personally identifiable student level data. So they can pin it to Johnny Smith, who lives at 123 Main Street in Appleton or wherever else. And so 9 states are going beyond their longitudinal database, and they're giving all of this information like this to a private database that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has funded called InBloom, all without parent consent. The ACT has also created in-school tests for grade schoolers that check student character traits, attitudes, and beliefs. This is essentially psychological profiling, and it can all go into a student's file. A February 2013 U.S. Department of Education report discussed testing student responses to learning programs using MRIs, posture tracking chairs, so if a student is slumping or where they're putting weight, and weighted computer mice, and physiological trackers on your skin to see if you're sweating, cool. The report, I have downloaded a copy of it that I have sent to lots of people who have asked about this. The report also discusses measuring student attitudes, beliefs, and behavior. They call it 21st century competencies, and here are some quotes. They want students to recognize bias in sources, be adaptable, have appreciation for diversity, have communication, collaboration, teamwork, and cooperation. They're going to judge them on their empathy, their perspective taking, trust, service orientation, and social influence with others. Oh yes, I really want a federal evaluator checking out my kids for any of those things. The last thing I'm going to talk about here is there is a self-described liberal, a doctor from, I believe it's Utah. He's a clinical psychologist, and it's his job to do psychological evaluations on people. So a couple of folks sent him all this information from the U.S. Department of Education and said, we want your professional opinion. So he's an expert in psychological and educational tests and related privacy laws and ethics. And I'm just going to give you about 3 quotes from him, and then I'll open up for questions. So he says, in psychological and cognitive tests, quote, the level of information provided about a particular child is both highly sensitive and extremely personal in nature. They are also extremely accurate, so they can buttonhole you. These are the kinds of things that the CIA literally uses to profile terrorists. And here's another quote from him. The accuracy of psychological testing has grown in the past 10 years to astonishing levels. The same tests used in our clinic for assessments are used in part by federal law enforcement agencies, the military, local police departments, and the CIA. Placed in the wrong hands, psychological testing can ruin lives as well as cause psychological trauma to people if they have knowledge that their results were used for nefarious purposes. And then he does a lot of comparing about how it's absolutely unethical and illegal for his clinic or any other psychological clinic to do what the federal government has just granted itself the power to do. So he says, we are subjected to multiple federal, state, and professional regulations when it comes to protecting and releasing mental health records. These records do not leave our clinic unless the guardians of the children instruct us or unless a court judge orders the release of the records. In some cases, we are even ethically obligated to fight court orders that request private mental health records. Common Core state standards radically changes this game. And here's the last one I'll leave you with. Given the gravity of these issues, I cannot professionally endorse the Common Core state standards as currently written until pointed clarification is provided by politicians and educators from both parties endorsing CCSS, Common Core state standards. Nor in good conscience can I enroll my toddler in a public school system that utilizes Common Core until these issues are clarified to my satisfaction. The issues involving psychological testing and privacy are issues that should be of concern to every parent with a child enrolled in public school. The power granted federal and state education administrators via the regulations of Common Core are unprecedented. All right, now I'm open for questions.
How do you opt out of Common Core that's already been implemented in your state?
Good question. There are a couple of options for you. None of them are extremely satisfactory. So for one of them, it's put your child in private or a homeschool. And I know that a lot of people cannot afford the time or the money that would require. Another option that you can at least try is, and as an addendum to what I just said, that's why it's extremely important for folks to insist on school choice in the least intrusive method possible, which I mean not requiring participating schools to administer Common Core tests. Another thing there is called a Common Core opt-out form, which is just a simple, like it's 1 page, 1.5 page that says, hi, I'm the parent of this child at your school. I do not approve of Common Core, and I don't want my kid in the classroom with Common Core or taking any Common Core tests. And now a number of parents have tried this already, and the school district have basically said, we can't have a choice but to teach your child Common Core. But something that you are legally allowed to opt your child out of every single test in your child's school. Just say, my child is not taking this test. And if your child, is given any standardized test, you can instruct your child to write at the top, I will not comply. That's all they have to write. Then they cannot be penalized for that, so on and so forth. And I also highly recommend that before it gets to that stage, if at all possible, pressuring everyone in any position of influence. This includes your school board, your state legislature, your governor, your friends. Tell anyone and everyone, because every second that we get closer to schools all doing it, the harder it is for anyone to backtrack. And we're already at a very hard point for reversing right now. There are 13 states right now who have active legislation to either withdraw or reconsider from Common Core. So that's a third of the states that are Common Core states right now. Indiana was one of them. Michigan, Georgia, Oklahoma, North Carolina. There is no legislation active in Ohio right now, but I know that folks there are starting to mobilize, like in Wisconsin. Anyway, there is a website, I think it's truthinamericaneducation.com, that tracks this. Missouri is one of them. Anyway, I think I've gotten about 8 of them, but that isn't all 13. So let me make sure that I heard your question, because I'm not sure if I heard all of it. It's just basically, how do you go to your local school board and present them this sort of information in a reasonable fashion and persuasive fashion? Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. I'm trying to think about where I should start with this. Are any of you familiar with outcomes-based education and what happened with that in about the 1990s? I'll give a short recap. One of my colleagues at the Heartland Institute, so I think this is a serendipitous placement, wrote a book about outcome-based education and what parents and local community members, the people who don't have the power, did to reverse it, to turn it back. So I just found that out a couple months ago and bought it on Amazon and read it. It's called Not With My Child You Don't by Robert Holland. But I can just, you don't have to read the book. I can give you the short version. So what happened was a way that seeded, I mean planting seeds. And this is what happened in Indiana as well with Common Core. What really got a bunch of folks listening and interested in making some change was when in Indiana, I'll just use those 2 moms that I know. There are 2 ladies, they're moms from Indianapolis. They've got kids, they have busy lives. Their names are Heather Crossan and Erin Tuttle. And they learned about Common Core when their kids, who were attending a private Catholic school, came home with a new math textbook. So it was different from the one that Heather's older child had in that class, and it was terrible. It was a lot worse. Her child didn't understand it. It was confusing. It was the classic fuzzy math that I talked about earlier. So she took it to her school and said, why are you doing this? This is a crummy textbook. And her school said, well, we're doing the Common Core standards a year early. We're ahead of the states. We're really proud of ourselves for that. So she thought, what's the Common Core? So she started researching it. And essentially what that led her to do, she and Erin, that's how I met them. They came up to Fort Wayne. They started doing presentations around the state to anyone who would have them. Rotary clubs, school boards, chambers of commerce, tea party groups, anyone. Doing and giving a presentation like, if I wish you could have seen my slides, but I will send them around, with their PowerPoint slides and all of their evidence and their facts, and just giving very straightforward presentations of the facts. Here is, here's this, here's the reference, so on and so forth. And once they did that, they had a group of folks who were extremely, they were concerned about it, and then they got their state legislator to sponsor a bill in the state legislature. I don't know who taught these ladies strategy, but they are very smart, very savvy. But one of the moms had worked in politics before she went home to be with her kids, but so I don't know where she got this. She's very smart. So she had this list of all these people, and she had them all sign, a statement saying we support removing Indiana from Common Core. And so when the senator got that bill to have a hearing, they all showed up. 120 people on a work day, on a school day, filling, this committee room saying, we want you to pass this bill. So often they held a rally, they held a press conference, very well organized. So and then so the bill passed the committee. They did the same thing, when it had the Senate vote. It was passed bipartisan, 38-11, very good margin. And so then when it went to the House in Indiana, the House Education Chair said, "I support Common Core. I'm not hearing this bill." So the coalition put out, they put out online a petition to the governor to say, "Governor Pence, please support this bill. Here are 73 organizations and 1,000 Hoosiers in 3 days who signed this. We want this bill passed." So the governor ignored them. Uh, and so then what their bill sponsor did, he's a happy fella, I guess. So there's basically a bunch of savvy people who were, they around that letter, they again had another press conference in the Capitol, invited all the media, they invited cameras, they sent out their, press releases. So a lot of very visible, very professional. They're always wearing suits, looking really well polished. And again, just given the facts, not looking like a bunch of crazies, just saying, look, I'm a mom and here's the evidence. And so what happened is their savvy bill sponsor just this week slipped out the Common Core bill, and he attached it to another bill now that it will get a House hearing. So we'll see what will happen with that. But it was a very it was tricky the whole entire step of the way. But returning to the outcomes-based education, what was very effective in those were a lot of public forums. So presentations with anyone will have you, and then debates, information meeting. Have someone from both sides talk about it if at all possible. Have people in the audience who are going to ask pointed questions of the folks on the other side, so on and so forth. Be very good about message control. Don't make yourself sound like a bunch of crazies, blaming the president. Leave him out of it. So on and so forth. So it's definitely a David and Goliath thing, but hey, well, it worked for David.
There's good point. Yeah, on the Truth in Education site, there are actually links to the YouTube videos of some moms at different school boards. So that was, inspiring. But I spoke to my kids' teachers as well. I didn't meet one teacher that liked it. And the English teacher pulled out was art. She told me this is what we do. And she also pointed out the fact that, it's so structured and so rigid.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you don't have to use the Common Core curriculum, but to find something that she would normally like to use to teach, it's almost impossible to find something anymore that can perfectly fit the criteria in the time frame allotted. So it almost ultimately leads to the federal curriculum. You would think teachers are moms. They can't.
Well, the thing about teachers is that they are afraid that they will lose their jobs if they speak up. Education is an extremely compliant group think culture, and by group think I don't mean to imply communism or something ridiculous. I just mean it's pretty collective, and they do that on purpose, and that's what education schools teach. And of course, if you're worried about your job, that's also an obviously big deal. So what you either need are some brave teachers, or some teachers who are willing, to send you, to sign or send you any information or give you their own stance about Common Core, and with you saying, "I'll withhold your names, but I'll pass it around." That was also actually really effective with outcome-based education. The Bob Holland, my colleague, he was a writer for the Richmond Times-Dispatch then. He got a Freedom of Information Act request to any teacher correspondence about the outcome-based education curriculum, and he hit a gold mine. He had teachers protesting to their school that this was terrible, it was going to degrade instruction, so on and so forth. So the more that you can, like I said, if you can get a teacher willing to speak out and talk about it, that is of course the best way to go about it. If you can't get them willing to be public, then you say, look, sign a teacher as close as you can, a teacher at this school, or a teacher in this school district, or in this town, or so on and so forth, and you collect those and you publicize them. I was going to make a comment about your, thought about curriculum, which is this a lot of times reminds me of Henry Ford's statement about the Model T. You can have it in any color you want as long as it's black. Same thing, you can have any curriculum you want as long as it's Common Core. Big choice.
Any other questions?
I have a question on the tracking device that you spoke about.
Yeah.
Is there a way of opting out of the tracking device if they want to put a tracking device? But would there be repercussions
Right.
for the child if you refuse to allow the tracking device?
So let me make a clarification about those. The Department of Education report did not recommend giving every child a tracking device. But what it did recommend were studies using MRIs, using those pressure-sensitive chairs, the physiological ones that can measure skin temperature or so on and so forth. So we're not, yet at the point where they're saying, oh, we'll hook every kid up to the machine. So I need to make sure that I made that clear. So it is unlikely that in the near future that most people's children have a device, tracked to them. Now, with that said, more and more schools are collecting biometric information from students. For example, there are palm scanners for lunch lines, or for admittance to the school, or they're called, they're supposed to provide the reduce fraud and provide security. Or there was a lawsuit in Texas recently about a girl. They had actually an RFID radio frequency identification device that in student IDs that every student was required to wear. And so she sued because, she believed religiously it was wrong to wear a government tracking device. And basically the judge said, if you want to attend your public magnet school, you have to do what the school says. So she withdrew from the school. So, it's like I said, it's probably not likely your child will be assigned a tracking device or have your school scanning his or her fingerprints or retina. But some schools and more schools are doing this, and they should darn well. There's another set of schools that are also attaching to kids' wrists. That's like a pedometer, but also like resting and waking sleep cycles. I mean, I don't know why school. It's supposed to be a health class thing, right? But I wouldn't want a school recording my kid's sleep cycles and her heartbeat and whatever else. It's none of your business.